In 1858, a young mother in New York poured a fresh glass of milk for her infant, trusting it without question. It looked pure and nourishing. But within days, the child was struck by a severe, unrelenting fever. That wasn't unusual. That was just the tragic reality of urban motherhood in the 19th century. How did the safest-seeming food on earth become a hidden killer of thousands of city children every single year? A glass of fresh milk, the most wholesome thing you could give a child, was quietly one of the deadliest. In the early 1800s, milk was a strictly local product, drawn from a family cow or a nearby farm. You drank it within hours of milking. There was no cold chain, no refrigeration, and no chemical preservation to save it. It was raw, natural, and generally safe, provided you lived surrounded by green pastures and fresh country air. Families knew their farmers, and the distance between the udder and the cradle was measured in footsteps, not miles. But then, the American city exploded in size, creating a logistical nightmare that would cost countless infant lives. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia filled with hundreds of thousands of workers, leaving no room for pastures or livestock. Families still needed milk, especially for their babies, so the fragile liquid had to be shipped from the distant countryside. Without ice or fast transport, rural milk often spoiled before it even reached the city limits during the brutal summers. Farmers tried hauling milk in slow, horse-drawn wagons. Under the summer sun, a 50-mile journey turned the cargo sour. Early railways offered a slight improvement, but the sloshing metal cans still sat for hours on warm, unshaded wooden platforms. The heat accelerated the growth of natural bacteria, turning a wholesome drink into a breeding ground for invisible illness. Even when it arrived intact, the milk was handled by middlemen using dirty pails, unwashed ladles, and unfiltered river water. City families found themselves buying milk that was already teeming with pathogens, though no one understood the concept of germs yet. The infant mortality rate spiked every summer. In New York, thousands of children perished before their first birthday. Grieving parents blamed the foul city air. They called the illness summer complaint, believing the humid heat itself was toxic. Nobody suspected the white liquid they were spoon-feeding their babies to keep them strong. That was just milk. If country milk couldn't survive the journey, businessmen realized they had to produce it locally, at any cost. They needed a way to keep thousands of cows inside the dense, filthy grid of an industrializing modern city. Pasture land in Manhattan was impossibly expensive. Bringing in hay and grain by the ton ruined the potential profit margins. Entrepreneurs needed a cheap, endless supply of animal feed right in the middle of the cramped urban slums. They didn't look to rural farmers for the answer. They looked to the largest, most profitable factories in the city. Breweries and whiskey distilleries were churning out thousands of gallons of alcohol, leaving behind mountains of hot, wet, fermenting grain. This leftover mash was called swill. It was practically free, fermenting, and cows could technically eat it to survive. Massive wooden dairy sheds were built directly attached to the city's booming whiskey and rum distilleries. Thousands of cows were marched into these dark, windowless barns in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Many never saw daylight again. They were packed into narrow wooden stalls, standing in their own filth, breathing stagnant air thick with ammonia and rot. A piping system delivered boiling hot, fermented mash straight from the distillery vats into the long wooden feeding troughs. The cows were essentially fed a boiling, alcoholic sludge. They ate it because there was simply nothing else available. The distillers turned their industrial waste into a highly lucrative second revenue stream, ignoring the biological toll. That sounds like an ingenious urban recycling program. It was, but the cost was paid in human bodies. The swill diet systematically destroyed the cows. Their teeth rotted out from the acidic, burning mash they consumed daily. They developed open sores across their bodies. Their tails routinely fell off from rampant disease and untreated bacterial infections. It was a nightmare of industrial agriculture hidden behind brick walls, operating without any sanitary oversight or veterinary care. These sick, dying animals were milked twice a day, by unwashed laborers working in dark, foul, and horrific conditions. The resulting liquid was not normal milk. It was a thin, sickly fluid drawn from feverish, chronically infected livestock. By some accounts, the swill milk industry produced over half of New York City's entire daily supply at its peak. It was cheap to produce and remarkably easy to distribute. The owners made a fortune selling what was essentially poison. Wagons bearing the names of fake country farms rolled out of the distillery yards every single morning at dawn. Mothers bought it directly from the street vendors, trusting the painted pastoral scenes on the side of the wooden carts. They paid their hard-earned pennies for what they believed was fresh, wholesome nourishment from the green hills of upstate. Instead, they were carrying home a bacterial time bomb, born in a dark shed beside a steaming whiskey vat. The deception was remarkably effective, targeting the most vulnerable citizens who could not afford to question their daily bread. But there was one glaring flaw in the product that threatened to expose the truth and ruin the entire business. Real cow's milk is rich, opaque, and slightly yellow from natural cream. Swill milk was an unsettling, unnatural substance. Because the cows lacked solid nutrition, their milk was watery, translucent, and carried a disturbing pale blue tint. It also smelled faintly of sour alcohol and decay. The liquid was visibly wrong to anyone who looked closely. No mother in her right mind would willingly feed pale blue, sour-smelling water to her newborn child. The dairy owners knew they had a severe cosmetic problem. They needed to make the sickly fluid look wholesome again. They couldn't change the diet of the cows, because that would ruin the profit margins of the distillery waste loop. Instead, they focused on deceiving the eye. They needed a cheap way to mimic the visual properties of real cream. This wasn't about improving nutrition. It was about sustaining an illusion just long enough to collect a few pennies. Their solution was a crude, unregulated form of food chemistry, practiced with whatever industrial powders they could buy in bulk. They set up mixing stations right inside the dairy sheds, preparing to doctor the fluid before it hit the streets. The goal was to transform a deadly byproduct into a convincing replica of nature's most trusted and innocent food. If it had stopped there, this would be a very different story. But they decided to fix the color. To get rid of the blue tint and add artificial thickness, they mixed in plaster of Paris and common white chalk. This gave the fluid a thick, bright white appearance, masking the watery translucence of the diseased swill milk. To recreate the yellow foam that usually sits at the top of a fresh pail, they whisked in raw eggs. Sometimes they even used yellow molasses or magnesia to simulate the rich creaminess of genuine fresh country milk. Finally, to hide the sour odor and slow down further decay in the summer heat, they dumped in baking soda. The finished product was a fraudulent, adulterated cocktail. It was milk in name only, masking a lethal biological reality. Vendors drove their carts through the poorest neighborhoods, ringing their bells and selling this doctored chalk water by the pint. In the 1850s, there were no food safety laws. No government inspectors tested the milk or checked the sanitary conditions. Adulteration was just a standard business practice. You bought your food at your own risk, trusting only the seller's word. Working-class families, struggling on low wages, had no choice but to buy the cheapest milk available to feed their children. They unknowingly fed their babies a mixture of water, chalk, and bacteria from diseased animals standing in deep manure. The results were devastating, but the suffering happened quietly behind closed doors in the city's poorest tenement districts. The truth remained hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look inside the guarded distillery walls. The infant death toll in New York City reached horrifying levels. By 1853, roughly half of all recorded deaths were children. Out of those, a staggering percentage were infants under the age of 1, dying mostly during the hot summer months. Graveyards filled with tiny wooden coffins, and the mourning clothes of Victorian mothers became a standard sight on city streets. A few observant physicians began to notice a pattern. The children weren't dying from the air, they were dying from the food. Dr. Robert Hartley was one of the first to investigate, tracing the terrible sickness directly back to the swill dairies. Hartley published essays exposing the horrific conditions of the distillery cows and the resulting toxic nature of the milk supply. He argued that the unnatural diet and unsanitary confinement were producing a poison that was slaughtering the city's youth. But the public mostly ignored his dense medical warnings. The working class didn't read academic journals, and the politicians didn't care. The dairies continued to operate, protected by their wealth and the sheer ignorance of the consumers buying the chalky fluid. It seemed the deadly cycle would continue forever, as long as the distilleries had waste and the cities had babies. Medical science knew the truth, but science alone lacked the megaphone required to mobilize a society into taking decisive action. The missing ingredient was outrage, and outrage required someone to show the public exactly what they were feeding their children. This is where the story takes a turn nobody sees coming, sparked by the power of the printed image. It wasn't until 1858 that the scandal broke wide open. A publisher named Frank Leslie decided to launch a media war. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper was famous for its detailed engravings and its willingness to tackle controversial, sensational urban topics. Leslie sent undercover reporters and sketch artists to infiltrate the dark, heavily guarded sheds of the Brooklyn and Manhattan distilleries. What they printed shocked the nation. Detailed engravings showed skeletal, diseased cows suspended by ropes because they could no longer stand. The artists captured the filth, the open sores, and the men mixing white powder into the milk vats with wooden paddles. The articles graphically described the foul stench, the pale blue fluid, and the chalk used to deceive the working mothers. Leslie coined the term swill milk, turning it from a hidden industrial practice into a front-page, inescapable public outrage. Citizens were disgusted and terrified. Mobs gathered outside the distilleries, demanding the owners be arrested and the toxic carts burned. The visual evidence was undeniable. Mothers realized that the wholesome white liquid they trusted was actually a cocktail of disease. The public demanded immediate government intervention to protect their children from this fraudulent, lethal food supply flooding their neighborhood. Committees were quickly formed at City Hall. Health inspectors were finally dispatched to examine the dairies and formally test the milk. Newspapers celebrated the expose, assuming the corrupt system would be dismantled overnight by the undeniable force of righteous public opinion. It seemed like a clear victory for public health. But the political machine had other plans for the swill dairies. The owners of the swill dairies were not small farmers. They were wealthy industrialists with strong ties to the Tammany Hall machine. Tammany Hall was the powerful organization that controlled New York City politics, and they always protected their lucrative business allies. When the city council formed a committee to investigate the dairies, it was packed with corrupt politicians loyal to the distillers. A notorious alderman named Michael Toomey, nicknamed Butcher Toomey, led the loud defense for the dairies during the public hearings. Toomey brazenly argued that swill milk was actually healthy, claiming it was just as nutritious as any fresh milk from the country. He brought in paid experts who testified that the cows were happy and the chalk was merely a harmless preservative. The committee's final report was a shameless whitewash. They concluded that the distillery cows were well kept and the milk was perfectly safe. They officially cleared the dairies of all charges, dismissing Frank Leslie's investigation as sensational journalism designed solely to cause a panic. It was a staggering betrayal. The city government looked at the dying children and chose to protect the corporate profit margins instead. The swill milk carts kept rolling through the streets. The chalk, the plaster, and the disease continued to flow unabated. This political cover-up cost thousands more lives. Even when New York passed a pure milk law in 1862, it lacked teeth. Adulteration remained a deadly threat for decades. The invisible bacteria continued to claim infants every single summer without fail. Science had identified the source of the sickness, but society lacked the tools and the political will to sanitize the chain. Picture a crowded tenement room in August. The heat is stifling, and a mother sits by a cradle, watching her child fade. She spent her last coins on milk, believing she was providing the only nourishment that could save her baby's fragile life. Instead, she was delivering the final blow. The fever spiked, the sickness worsened, and the child quietly slipped away. The summer months became a seasonal slaughter, widely accepted as a tragic but entirely inevitable part of urban, working-class existence. Historians estimate that in 19th century New York, up to a third of all children died before reaching the age of 5. A vast portion of these deaths was linked to milk-borne pathogens like bovine tuberculosis, salmonella, and deadly strains of diphtheria. The tragedy wasn't just the staggering number of deaths. It was the cruel, mocking irony of how these children died. Parents were trying to do the right thing. They trusted a fundamental food source that had sustained humanity for millennia. They didn't know the world had changed. They didn't know the distance between farm and table had created a deadly gap. The milk bottle became a symbol of maternal care, even as it acted as a hidden vessel for lethal, invisible contamination. Undertakers did a brisk business in small pine coffins. Cemeteries filled with tiny graves marked with short, heartbreaking dates of birth. The society mourned, but it also adapted. Victorian mourning culture, with its post-mortem photography and black crepe, formalized the endless grief. To stop the dying, humanity needed a way to kill the unseen enemy hiding inside the white liquid before it was drunk. The answer didn't come from an American politician. It came from a French chemist looking at souring vats of wine. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur proved that invisible microorganisms were responsible for the spoiling of wine and beer in France. He discovered that gently heating the liquid killed the bacteria without ruining the taste, a process soon named pasteurization. It took decades for the medical establishment to apply this simple, world-changing concept to the commercial, urban milk supply. Even when the science became clear, many dairy farmers angrily resisted pasteurization. It required expensive new equipment and tighter sanitary protocols. They argued that heating milk destroyed its natural nutrients. Some cynically claimed it was just a trick to sell old, stale milk. The breakthrough in America came from a philanthropist named Nathan Strauss, who had tragically lost a child to illness himself. In 1893, Strauss set up subsidized milk depots across New York City, selling only pasteurized milk to the poor and working class. He absorbed the costs, offering clean, safe milk for pennies. The results were immediate and statistically undeniable for the city's health. In the neighborhoods where Strauss's depots operated, the infant mortality rate plummeted. The dreaded summer slaughter finally began to slow down. Over the next 20 years, the scientific evidence became overwhelming. Pasteurization was a reliable shield against deadly milk-borne disease. Cities across America gradually passed strict ordinances requiring all commercial milk to be pasteurized and transported in modern refrigerated cars. The battles fought over a simple glass of milk laid the groundwork for the food safety standards we rely on today. Sanitary glass bottles replaced the filthy, open dipping cans, ensuring the product wasn't contaminated on the family doorstep. Today, you can walk into any supermarket and pull a cold, sealed gallon of milk from a brightly lit refrigerator case. You pour a glass for a child without a second thought, trusting the dates on the label and the seal on the cap. That trust wasn't a natural right. It was bought and paid for by generations of mothers who suffered unimaginable, quiet losses. The Swill dairies are gone, buried under the modern streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan, mostly erased from the urban memory. But their dark legacy is the reason your food is safe today. They forced the invention of modern public health systems. This is exactly why every sip of milk today represents a triumph of science over a ruthless, unregulated industrial nightmare. The next time you open a fresh carton, remember the 19th century mothers who risked everything on a glass of white liquid. The substance changed. The maternal instinct did not. The only difference is that today, the milk won't bite back. If this dark journey into the past kept you hooked, take a moment to subscribe and like the video. We uncover bizarre, forgotten histories like this every single week, and your support genuinely helps the channel grow. Drop a comment below and tell us which everyday item you want us to uncover the hidden history of next.